Hello, my name is Christina Mitchell. I am with the University of San Diego, and this presentation that I'm giving you today is a continuation of a prior study that mapped the current Guatemalan nonprofit sector, something that simply has not been accomplished in Guatemala's post-conflict reality. We feel contextualizing the sector and discovering its interactions are important, considering the extensive amount of nonprofit engagement, particularly international nonprofit engagement, that has been present in the country since peace was achieved in 1996. I authored this paper in conjunction with Ignacio Ochoa of Fundación Nual and Edwin Villela of Fundación para la Educación en Guatemala. They're unable to travel to be with us today, but they do send their greetings and they appreciate your interest in their organizations. So I'm going to begin this discussion by briefly stating our problem, and then I'm going to give you a very condensed understanding of Guatemalan history in relation to the nonprofit sector. And then I'll provide a summary of the specifics related to the research. And then I'm going to present the cases of Fundación Nual and Fundación para la Educación in Guatemala, and then quickly move to the analysis. I'm going to end with a discussion and then present a conclusion. Now, our research question asked, given a Guatemalan nonprofit leader who's located in North America and located either temporarily or permanently, how does that leader's understanding of his social realities of his position, informed by his multiple identities that he holds, as any of us hold, his transnational cross-border context and his lived experience, influence the actions that he takes on behalf of his organization? And what we found, as we're going to continue to explore, is that first and foremost, these leaders are Guatemalan. And this is not simply an identity, but it dominates his understanding of the Guatemalan situation. And this Guatemalan understanding, this Guatemalan positionality, is based on the leader's past experiences, things that he has lived through. And then because of his binational position, the leader really is never fully in North America or Guatemala, but operates from a space somewhere between the two locations. And in literature, this is considered a borderland location. And this positionality is used to promote an equal voice and empowerment of the Guatemalan people. So very quickly, a rundown of Guatemala's history, which the history, unfortunately, happens to be one of continuous brutal discrimination against the indigenous Maya population. It was colonized by the Spanish, who instituted a feudalistic society in support of their market agriculture economy. And this feudalistic society continued well past independence, which was achieved in the 19th century from Spain, and into the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century. Now, U.S. interest in Guatemala started up during the Cold War, post-World War II. In Guatemala, there was a democratically elected government. This government started putting into place certain democratic reforms, and one of those reforms was land redistribution. A U.S. corporation, the United Fruit Company, felt that these, who had extensive land holdings within Guatemala, felt that these reforms, especially the land reform, wasn't exactly fair. They went to the United States government. They said, look, these reforms are communistic in basis. The U.S. government then orchestrated a coup through the CIA to overthrow the democratically elected government in Guatemala. That put into place a series of military regimes. Now, civil war broke out quite quickly following the overthrow of the government by internal forces, and lasted a number of years. It had its ebbs and flows. The worst of the conflict actually took place in the 1980s. Um, Moving back a little bit to the 1950s with Fidel Castro's success in taking over Cuba, there was several people's movements that erupted in Central America. And they also erupted in Guatemala. And these guerrilla movements moved quickly to try to oust the military governments. In the 1980s, the military government decided, okay, that's it, and they really put into place this very brutal scorched earth policy to try to rid the country of the guerrillas. Now, the guerrillas were housed in the mountainous regions of Guatemala. Unfortunately, those were also the regions that were inhabited by the indigenous Maya, and so numerous Maya were killed, and it has been ruled a genocide. Peace finally came to the country in 1996. The peace accords, if you read them, are very neoliberal in their construction, meaning that all emphasis and money was placed at the ground level in order to develop the country. And what this did is this quickly expanded the nonprofit sector. At the time that the peace accords were signed, it was estimated that there were between 1,000 and 1,500 nonprofit organizations. Now estimates state that there's probably as many as 10,000 nonprofit organizations operating within the country. And it really is unknown how many of these organizations are indigenous-led, and it is equally unknown how many indigenous-led nonprofits exist outside of Guatemala, whose purpose is to support Guatemalan communities. Now, as I said before, this is based off of a previous research study where we mapped the Guatemalan nonprofit sector. And what we did essentially is we took theoretical concepts from nonprofit literature, both here in North America, and then we found some sources, Guatemalan sources, and we put those two together through a case study, and we're able to map them through an ecological framework, since we really don't have any databases to go off of, so we don't really know how many are operating, how many nonprofits are operating in the country. And so what we do is we see the Guatemalan nonprofit system as this diverse global presence situated between government and market entities. And this environment consists of the individual, so that's you and me, who might be operating in the nonprofit sector. It also consists of the microsystem, which are those immediate groups of influence, such as the family or the work group. And at these levels here is where you're going to see the community-based organizations, the victims organizations, and the charitable organizations. On top of that is the meso level, and those are the influential systems outside of the immediate group, such as the nonprofit office context or the school system. And this is where you're going to encounter the Guatemalan non-governmental organizations. On top of that is the exosystem, and this is the overriding impactful system, such as the corporation or the local government, and this is where you see the government sector organizations, the international governmental organizations, and then of course the Guatemalan government in general. The next system is the macro system, and this houses all of the ideologies, the values, the norms, the institutional patterns of the exosystem, mesosystem, and the microsystem, all of these interactions that are taking place. But if we look at the bigger picture, the macro system is also where the influences of the international NGOs comes into play, and the Washington, D.C. NGOs that still have a conspicuous presence within the country. And of course, all of this is bounded by time, past and present. Things move because they're influenced by the history as well as what might come in the future. Now, we also learned through the literature and through the case study that there are 3 levels of engagement with the nonprofit sector. And the first level extends from the individual to the macro system. So this is where you're going to see the INGOs that are working at the local community levels, but they're usually funded from outside of the country. Level 2 extends from the micro to the macro, and these individuals don't necessarily get involved with the well-being of the individual or the local communities. They feel that they are representing the individuals at the lower level with the Guatemalan government and with the international governments. Then, of course, you have the lower interaction, the meso and the that extends from the mesosystem, microsystem, and individual system. And those are individuals that feel that they are accompanying those indigenous, native, ground level people that live in Guatemala. They have more of hands-on individual interaction with Guatemalans and with the Maya. And important to this inquiry is we saw something missing here based on our engagement, that perhaps there is a 4th level of engagement that is operating right here between the micro and the individual systems of native or indigenous nonprofit leaders who regularly cross borders into North America to acquire resources in support of their nonprofit mission. And we knew from previous engagement that we knew at least one existed, but we don't know how many others exist. And we were curious as to what's going on with these individuals and how can we understand these individuals' relationship or interaction with the Guatemalan nonprofit system. So the first organization that we knew existed, we already had these in our sites because we had interaction with the individual. Is Fundación Noel, Ignacio Ochoa, who's the legal representative. I don't necessarily have a lot of time to go into specifics about the organization. If you look on my website, there are complete rundowns, PDFs of each organization, what their mission and what they've accomplished, especially, and also includes links to their websites and things. Fundación Noel is a registered Guatemalan membership association in Guatemala. And it concentrates on creating vibrant, active civil society with indigenous communities. Ignacio has a very colorful past, having obtained the equivalent of a bachelor's and a master's degree through the system of Central American Jesuit universities. He's traveled extensively throughout Central America, and he boasts of such things as having picked coffee for the Sandinistas. He left the Jesuits after some colleagues of his were killed in El Salvador when the government of El Salvador expelled the Jesuits from their country. He then proceeded to work with Mayan refugees, trying to bring them back into the country of Guatemala, and eventually transitioned into his community advocacy and empowerment role. In order to support his vision for his organization, he has on numerous occasions completed educational programs in the United States, and at the time of the writing for this study, he was on a student visa to Vancouver, British Columbia, attending a First Nations or an Indigenous or Native university in order to obtain a substance abuse certification, training that he hopes to implement within his own organization when he works with the indigenous communities. Most of all, and I think most importantly, he maintains strongly that Guatemala is his home, and it will remain his home and his center of operation. The second case that we came up with took some looking and some contacts to actually get in touch with. Very under the radar, not necessarily out there, very small organization called Fundación para la Educación, or Help for Schools Incorporated, which is a registered 501c3 in the United States whose mission is to help rural schools in Guatemala. The president is Edwin Villela, and he was raised in the agricultural southwest of Guatemala. When Edwin was 14, he lost his father to the war in a community skirmish against the guerrillas. Um, he did attempt Guatemalan military school, but his worldview didn't necessarily match up with the military's worldview. So he left there and eventually went to a public university, obtaining a language degree. His mother had immigrated to the U.S. to find work to support his family, and his brothers and sisters eventually followed. Edwin stayed in Guatemala working in the banking sector in the capital until the 1980s, when the war really started getting very bad. Once he immigrated to the U.S., he worked factory jobs while attending school, and first he learned English and then eventually entered a real estate program at a local community college. As a realtor and a bit more financially established, Edwin returned to Guatemala and traveled the country extensively and really saw how the people were struggling post-conflict. And so he, along with other Guatemalan migrants in Los Angeles and San Diego area, decided to establish a nonprofit organization to try to help their home communities and other rural communities. And the organization sees education as a sustainable endeavor that can help Guatemala develop. Edwin regularly travels to Guatemala to carry out his mission for the organization, and he and his wife actually own property near his home village, and that is where they plan to retire. They have a home there, and that is where they plan to retire. Now, in looking at the data, there's a number of interesting commonalities between Ignacio and Edwin as leaders. I'm not going to name all of these. Both experienced the war. Both seem to be a bit exploratory in the way they conduct themselves. They both have show an importance of education that in their lives, hold that as a value. They seem to traverse environmental, meaning countries, between communities and the cities, those types of things, and also professional boundaries and borders. They seem to go back and forth between those pretty easily and comfortably. And both of them believe that the Guatemalans are responsible for sustainable change for their country. Now, there are a few very notable differences. They're not the same individuals. Ignacio had the Jesuit training. Edwin had some military training. Ignacio is very sympathetic with the people's movements, or the guerrilla engagement, and the rights, the ideology of the rights that those people's movements held. Edwin saw the guerrillas as communist base and really had strong feelings against their engagement in the country. Ignacio remains very critical of NGOs, especially international NGOs, feeling that they are not engaging the people of the communities and involving them as much as they should. Edwin is favorable of NGOs. He believes that it takes all of us to make a difference to actually develop the country. But probably the biggest takeaway, or actually what is the biggest takeaway, is that these common experiences and even the differences, they break down into identities based on lived experiences, which actually inform the leader's understanding, or the leader's positionality, that then influence the actions the leader takes in relation to his organization. And this is a theoretical model that we came up with, and it is based within a human ecology frame, explaining how the positionality of the leader works. So what we have here is we have the leader, and as you can see, he is positioned between North America and Guatemala. He has one foot within each country. He's straddling that borderland position. Now, the individual himself understands his reality based on who he is as an individual, whether it be father, professional, nonprofit leader, realtor, student, also Guatemalan. He is a Guatemalan. All of that, all of those identities intersect here and help his understanding of his reality. Also, his lived experience, all of the experiences that he's had up until this point, his education, the war, they also inform his understanding of his reality. As a result, all of this mixes in and translates into the actions and the decisions that the leader makes on behalf of his organization. Now, exactly how does this work? If we take a common thing like education, which both of them received, they received education both in Guatemala or Central America and North America, and in North America. That actually gives them certain identities. They are Guatemalan. They identifies them as students. It gave them the education gave them the ability to actually consider themselves professionals. As such, the experience filters to the way the leaders understand the world and the differences in the world, and they see education as positive, and hence they value that education. Thus, their organizations have education as a focal point of their mission. And to carry out this mission, they use their access to North America and to Guatemala to obtain resources to carry out their mission. And this is actually a reciprocal exchange, as their work benefits both North America and Guatemala through the exchange of information, knowledge, and supports. Now, there are a few things that came out of that we can say came out of this study of these leaders. We do know that Native or indigenous individuals from the global South have entered the nonprofit sector through transnational engagement. The thing is we really don't know who they are. We don't know where to find them. And then we really are curious how they do accomplish their organizational mission. We can also state that Native or indigenous transnational nonprofit leaders and organizers possibly have certain characteristics. They seem to have a strong or Native indigenous identity. They may have achieved some education, or at least know where to locate information to educate themselves. They encompass the ability to create these cross-border networks and mobilize action, which is really quite impressive considering that the limited amount of funds that they have in comparison to some of the big international nonprofit organizations. But do they have characteristics such as socioeconomic factors or education that actually enables or influences their nonprofit capabilities? In other words, are there things that actually foster the presence of these individuals in a way that they wouldn't, that an uneducated or somebody without resources, a Native or an indigenous Guatemalan, would not be able to tap into. And then we can say that Native or indigenous transnational nonprofit leaders and organizers hold an insider-outsider consciousness as a negotiated way of knowing and interacting with the world. That can sometimes perhaps be confining and conflicted. You have to understand they're never really considered insiders no matter where they are. They're always considered a little bit of an outsider. But as we've seen, they also, this consciousness also has the ability to be very creative and transforming. But we don't know how this insider-outsider consciousness actually manifests itself. How does the leader, the organizer, engage in this negotiation to acquire resources to support their organization, the stakeholders, and its beneficiaries? And then how do these leaders seek out and use this knowledge and information? And otherwise, how does this insider-outsider consciousness actually operationalize? What we can say in conclusion is that through this case study, we have come up with a definition for who these leaders are. We can say that the Native or the indigenous transnational nonprofit leader is a skilled leader, native to a country outside of North America or Europe, who frequently crosses borders to obtain resources and foster relationships, both locally and internationally, to achieve their nonprofit mission, which benefits their country of origin. And using this definition is where my dissertation research then picks up. We're going to that next level to see if we can answer some of these other questions. Specifically, I'm looking at the way that insider-outsider consciousness operationalizes. So I do have a list of references for you. The PowerPoint will be available on my website, so you can definitely pull that off of there if you're interested. I would like to make a request that if you do know of these types of indigenous or native transnational leaders, if you have contact with them, if you could please get in contact with me either through my email or through my website, I would be very appreciative. I would love to be able to talk with them. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you, and hopefully this raises some questions and some greater insight. Thank you.